everyone, this is Amanda Moore from the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, and you're listening to the ASF podcast, the show that explains everything you want to know about Angelman Syndrome. We're so excited you're here, and we hope you enjoy the show. For this week's podcast, we have repurposed a webinar that was recorded in years past, but the information is still very much relevant today. We hope this information helps you on your journey. Enjoy the listen. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you guys here for night number 2 or day number 2 of the virtual ASF Family Conference. You guys are in for a treat tonight. We have a great panel that's going to talk everything clinical trials. We know as a community right now, there's so many exciting things happening for the Angelman community around clinical trials. And we know a lot of you have questions. So I want to encourage you all to put questions in the chat box. This is a live panel, so we'll be able to answer as many questions as we can. And I also want to remind you guys, just because I have to, if you haven't signed up to give feedback yet, to express feedback for good, do it now, please. We have a chance to get $50,000, which could impact our community in a big way. All you have to do is text ASF to 90412 and get signed up. I'm going to stop talking because I know you're not here to see me. I'm going to introduce my wonderful friend and colleague and all-around rock star, Dr. Elizabeth Jalazo. She is not only a parent to Evelyn, who is 6, right? Almost 7 soon, 6 years old with Angelman syndrome. She's also leads our clinic, our Angelman syndrome 15Q clinic network, research network, and she's leading all of our efforts around this clinical work. So we're very lucky to have her. She's going to moderate the panel tonight and introduce all of our amazing people that are on tonight. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Elizabeth Jalazo.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome to our community who's in the audience tonight. Welcome to our fabulous panelists. I will hand it over actually to each of you to introduce yourself in just a moment. I will give a brief introduction, but I just wanted to say, as I'll reiterate what Amanda says, this is a really incredibly exciting time for the community. You know, last night we heard updates from a lot of pharmaceutical companies in the space, many of whose names you know, many whose names you may not know, but it's an exciting time with lots of exciting clinical trial news, but with that can come a lot of anxiety. And so my goal tonight is really to get the questions of the community answered. We have been collecting questions from the community. So I have a list of questions that have already been gathered to bring forth to our panelists here tonight. But don't be shy. If there are questions, please throw them in the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the session tonight. And if we don't get to your question, we'll try to get it answered and responded back. The other reminder that I will give to everybody tonight, both our community as well as our panelists, is that our goal tonight is to talk generally about clinical trials. We're not talking specifically about any of the ongoing clinical trials because they are just that, really early ongoing clinical trials. And while I know it's tempting, both from a PI standpoint, perhaps to share, and also from a community standpoint to ask these really specific questions that we really want to get answers to, I'll just remind you guys that our panelists will not be able to give information other than what's publicly kind of available information. But ask your questions. We'll try to get them all answered tonight. So, as Amanda said, I'm Liz Jalazo. I'm the clinical director for the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, and I will be moderating all the sessions all week. So you guys will be sick of me, and I'll try to get a more interesting backdrop. This is a boring corner of my house here. All right. So I'm going to start just by going around, and I'd like you guys to introduce yourselves. First, I have Dr. Shefali Jeste, who I believe has just recently moved to Children's Hospital of LA. Did I get that correct?
I have, exactly.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, if I can get everybody to tell us who
Hi,
you are,
everyone.
Where you are, and kind of what your experience has been in clinical trials, either in the Angelman community or outside.
Yeah, no, of course. So yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Shefali Jeste. I'm a pediatric neurologist, and I was at UCLA for 11 years and just moved to CHLA last month to be chief of neurology here. And I'm also a professor of pediatrics here at USC. And I specialize in neurodevelopmental disorders. And I will say that the landscape of neurodevelopmental disorders has completely changed over the last decade, but I would say like even the last 3 or 4 years, where, our research that was focused on trying to, find markers of early symptoms of neurodevelopmental disabilities, or thinking about what kind of clinical endpoints might be helpful if we ever had a therapeutic, which is really what much of my research was in, biomarkers and clinical endpoints and early detection. That research that we hoped would lead to treatments one day has all of a sudden now become integrated directly into clinical trials. And now we're in this like space of therapeutics, which is just incredibly exciting. I feel like we can give families much more, I would say, hope that we're at least working towards that space, that Angelman has really led the field in that way. So my work in clinical trials is largely around, I like to think of it as clinical trial readiness. So my lab focuses quite a bit on identifying brain-based biomarkers that can be used in trials, thinking about clinical endpoints, meaning what are the clinical features like behavioral features and developmental features that we might want to try to change or improve with these therapeutics, and how do we measure those in kiddos who might be minimally verbal or who might have significant motor challenges, and those sorts of things. So we do a lot of work with different genetic syndromes and conditions that are associated with neurodevelopmental disorders, and Angelman is one of them. I also have done a lot of research in Duke 15q syndrome, and so now we have this 15q clinical research network that brings the two populations together, which has been great. When I was at UCLA, I was the PI of the Fresius natural history study for Angelman, and also was the PI of Tangelo. So we were directly involved with that ASO trial, and those are staying at UCLA. I'll just quickly say that we are going to have a 15q clinic at CHLA. It's going to be awesome, multidisciplinary. We'll probably launch in October. And we hope to have trials here as well once I get a little more settled. So with that, I'll stop and just say it's been really fun to work with the patient advocacy group. I mean, none of this work would be possible, frankly, without our parent partnerships.
Awesome. Thank you, Shefali. All right. Going around my screen, we have Dr. Carlos Bacino, who is a geneticist at Baylor College of Medicine. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. So for the people who don't know me, I am a clinical geneticist, and I have started working at Texas Children and Baylor College of Medicine back in '95. And still there. And about a few years later, I started working in collaboration with Art Baudet, who had a very, committed interest in Angelman syndrome. And that's how I got started in some of the early trials. And initially, they were more like natural history, and then moving on to some other dietary modifications that he was hoping to be a way to start some of these conversations going in treatment. And obviously from now, we have gone all the way now to start talking about gene modification therapies, which is certainly very exciting. I am currently the medical director of the Angelman Syndrome Clinic. So we have this multidisciplinary clinic for about now 2.5 years. And before that, I was actually following a lot of the patients with Angelman syndrome, since I have been involved in some of the clinical trials. So I have been sort of the go-to person in my group for all of the Angelman syndrome patients. So it's been fun, obviously, working with the community, and I'm certainly very excited to see what's going on. As Shefali was saying, that all of a sudden you have all of these competitions, so to speak, which is good to have all of these therapies and possibilities that may impact significantly the community. So I guess I will stop here, and I will let probably Liz come next.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure it probably feels a little surreal after being in the community for so long to see the landscape have changed so much in the last year, and seeing all this excitement around clinical trials. And last but not least, Dr. Liz Berry-Kravis, a child neurologist at Rush. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, so I'm Liz Berry-Kravis, and I'm a pediatric neurologist at Rush in Chicago. And we really got into the clinical trials field in about 2002, when we started with a very similar, abrupt, large number of disease mechanism based trials for Fragile X syndrome, and learned a lot about what not to do in clinical trials for developmental disorders, because we were really the first ones there, and this had not been done before. There had been trials for behavior, but not for targeting the underlying disease mechanism. So as time has gone on, we've learned, we've modified. Some of what we've learned has been utilized in developing the clinical trials process for Angelman syndrome. And our program, as a result of our experience over now almost 20 years, has blossomed into a clinic and a translational research program for Angelman syndrome, for Phelan-McDermott syndrome, for Rett syndrome, for Fragile X syndrome, and for numerous other things. So we continue to work, and I think we still have a lot to learn about what the best ways are to demonstrate benefit in these trials. And as Shefali was saying, we're always working on developing newer and better outcomes that will really show us when we're changing the brain, which is really what we're trying to do. So I'm not going to go on, and because the point is that we want to answer the questions, and so we can go ahead maybe.
Well, I think that's probably going to really be a theme of this week. And it was certainly a theme, I think, that came through, or a thread at least came through in the industry presentations last night. And it was a theme of the scientific sessions today, is really developing appropriate outcome measures to be able to measure change in our patient population. So I have a list of questions here, but I want to make sure we get to everybody's questions. So I'm just going to jump right in here, since we have folks who are going ahead and chomping at the bit with questions. So I'm going to throw this first one to you, Dr. Barry Kravis. And again, I'm throwing these out, but it's perfectly fair to say we cannot answer some of these questions. But so the first question we got here is, when will the GTX 102 clinical trial restart? Has the FDA approved the new protocol for this trial? And do we know anything about where sites might be? Is there anything that we know about that?
Well, we know some things. Some things we know and can't say, and other things we know and can at least say. So we have been back and forth with the FDA over an extended period of time, and I think we are still working with the FDA. We're making progress with the FDA. Progress can be slow. And so an answer on this is expected maybe next month, hopefully at the latest in 2 months. In the meantime, both the UK and Canada have approved the new genetics protocol, and they will be enrolling patients soon in those areas. And perhaps if those countries get going first and we get some additional safety data out of that, that may spur the FDA forward a little bit. But we really have been dealing with this off and on now for almost a year, and so it's a little painful, but progress is being made, and that's really about what I can say.
That's optimistic, and it certainly has been a lesson for the community about how clinical trials can go sometimes, and that things don't necessarily always go the way that we expect, and that these kind of pauses can happen, but it doesn't mean that it's permanent. All right. So the next question is, what age group will the clinical trials be targeting? Anybody is welcome to jump in. I think there's a handful of clinical trials that we're expecting probably over the next couple of years, and general ideas about age groups. Dr. Shefali.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, there's this general gestalt that we haven't actually proven, but that the earlier you treat, the better, because you're, especially in some of these therapies that are really, modifying the impact of the genetic change, that you might then kind of open the door to help an infant or a young child, learn better and kind of access interventions in a different way. But we don't necessarily know that. And the flip side to that is that we also have less information generally about safety, and even sometimes less information about clinical endpoints and biomarkers in the really little ones. So we're always stuck in this position of, we'd love to treat really early, but how early can we treat? Are we going to measure things differently if we treat really early? Because babies change so fast in so many ways. And so we don't have a great answer for that. So I think, as you'll see, most of the trials have a pretty wide age range that starts in early childhood and goes through late childhood, even into adolescence. A lot of, our patients ask us, why not adults? Do you think that it's not possible to improve, functioning or quality of life or whatever we're aiming to improve in adults? And the answer again is we don't know. I mean, I think the closest example we might have is in tuberous sclerosis. There was a big clinical trial that was done that included late adolescents, and they struggled to find as much change in some of their measures, like in daily living skills and cognition and those sorts of things in the older kiddos. And we don't know if that's just, again, if it's a measurement issue, like some of our measures just don't change as fast in adults, or is it actually that the drug or the therapy may not work as quickly or as well in an adult? So we'd love to include everyone, but part of the issue is that we have to be narrow enough that if it does or doesn't work, we can be really clear that it wasn't just because of the wide age range. You know what I mean? But I would love to see trials being done as early in development as possible. That's sort of my overall perspective on that. But I'm sure the others have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can jump in here and maybe provide a little bit of specifics of what we know. In general, I agree with Shefali that we want to go earlier, but we don't know what UBE3A does at what stages of development. So we don't know what we can get back totally at any age. And even if we could improve things somewhat in adults, that would still be valuable, albeit we may have the largest effect in the youngest kids started on treatment. In terms of specifics, Roche is working on getting the 1 to 4-year-old cohort open in the USA. They have a process going on with the FDA, and we may find out that cohort has already been enrolling in Europe, and we may find out if the FDA allows that cohort to go forward sometime in the next month or two. I think genetics, we know what the age range for genetics was. It was 4 to 17, and I believe that is pretty much locked in at this point until they get past, sort of the bump they've had with the adverse event. And Ionis Biogen presented at the clinical trials session that they are going to be looking at a broader age range that includes adults as well as young children, as well as the mid-range. So I think we don't know exactly what age range some of the gene therapy trials may go with. So things are a bit open right now. The FDA has obviously made it clear that something that's a new genetic therapy is not going to start in kids really young right away, because Roche went in with that and they wouldn't allow them to do it. So we won't be starting with the very youngest kids until we've done a safety project in kids that are somewhat older, although the FDA did not require adults to be treated first, which is a bit of an evolution for them, because of the recognition that in some of the preclinical models and in the general thinking that earlier treatment would probably give a more recognizable response.
Yeah, I think if I recall correctly, Ionis said ages 2 to 50. So I think it's intriguing, and it will certainly give us a little bit, more information to be able to answer that question about exactly what we might expect across the lifespan. Dr. Bassino, can you weigh in a little bit on, some of this decision making behind why a company might choose a certain age range?
I think that if you look at clinical trials in general, I think that obviously, when you work with a population that is a little bit older, you are able to recognize side effects or some of the problems that may be associated with that drug more easily than if you're dealing with an infant. So I think that the decision comes around that, and also comes around in the ability for an older child to manifest or to be able to show in an easier way. So I think that it goes around those parameters. I would agree with Liz that I think that there is a need probably also for older population, given that my concern is that with a lot of these Angelman patients, that as they got older, they start developing a lot of different problems and experiencing changes not for the best that could be actually benefiting from some type of therapy. So although I agree that, doing the younger ones will probably give us the best possibility for development, I would say that, maybe rescuing some of the seizure phenotypes and some of the movement disorders and problems that you see in adult patients will be really very important. So I was very excited to hear that Ionis is moving into a broader, age spectrum.
Yeah, I think this also highlights just how early on we are in this clinical trial space, right? We're just really in the early infancy of clinical trials in the Angelman space. All right, so the next question here for Liz, is UPD currently included in any clinical trials? And if not, will it be included in the future?
So I don't know of any that it is being included in currently. Certainly for the ASO trials, there's a lot of worry about doing that because essentially what you're doing is reactivating two paternal genes, or two genes that are behaving like paternal genes instead of just one. And in the normal situation, people don't have two genes active. And so because of situations like 15q duplication syndrome and questions about whether it's okay to have twice as much UBE3A, there's a lot of fear of doing that. Now, we all know that these treatments aren't perfect, and so they may not actually produce twice the level of the protein. And so it may be just fine to use these treatments in people with UPD, but I think until we establish safety and efficacy in the deletion population, it's unlikely that ASOs will be used in UPD. On the other hand, gene therapy to me actually makes a lot more sense to use in UPD because in this case, the specific deficit is UBE3A and the gene therapy is targeting UBE3A. So I don't know what the gene therapy trials exactly are going to do. I think the scientific advisors are still kind of working with the companies and the companies are trying to figure out what to do. But it does make sense to include UPD patients in a gene therapy trial. And in fact, that may even be the most pure population for them to use based on the mechanism that they're targeting. So for right now, and certainly a trial of a substrate type medication like what Ovid was doing, it doesn't really make sense to exclude UPD patients from those trials. So I think right now we're just talking about ASO trials because that's what's out there. But as new things come on board, I expect there may be a broader inclusion of UPD patients.
All right, we'll get to Wenhan's comment here in a moment. There's a fabulous question from Debbie Sukin. What do you guys, and I'm going to open this up to everybody because I think this is a really great question. What do you need as clinical trial sites to launch trials? How can the community help you? Are there things that you need? Shefali,
that's such a great question. I appreciate that question a lot because as I said in the beginning, I think these trials have to be a partnership between the sites and families. Some of and again, I lived this firsthand at UCLA because we had never done a trial like this at UCLA, especially in a pediatric population. So I got to see all the challenges unfold and luckily was able to, call on my colleagues like Dr. Kravis here, who's done this for so long and done it so well to get some guidance. But, at the institutional level, a lot of it is really practical issues that we face that make it hard to start trials. So we need the expert team that can help us. We call it like the regulatory aspect. So it's like making sure we can work with the industry partner to get the budget in place and get contracts signed quickly and make sure that the ethical approval, the IRB approval is complete. Like really mundane, they seem mundane and administrative, but those things can take a very long time if you don't have the expert team in place. And so there's that. And then there's having like expert study coordinators who have run trials before, who know how to help facilitate the process. And again, Liz is a great team in place now. I sort of created a team at UCLA and learned from colleagues who are doing trials in other conditions, like in neuromuscular disorders like SMA and other things. So that a lot of that doesn't require the patient advocacy group so much. It's really us being able to have the infrastructure. I think from the patient advocacy group side, it's really around having, working to help engage the community. I think there's a lot of misinformation that's out there about, and that's our fault largely, about what a trial entails. What are our goals? What does it mean to be in a trial? What are the pluses and minuses of being in a trial? And I think that kind of communication, to have that information available, especially from families who have been in trials, that can then talk to other families who might not be so sure, might be nervous about, what this trial might involve or the long-term implications of being involved. I think having parents to communicate with families and be ambassadors for the studies, I think that's incredibly helpful. And then, again, we need to have enough kiddos in the community or adults in the community that can come and enroll. And so, having, again, an engaged group who can be ready to enroll once the trial's open, so that we can meet our goals. Because I think, our industry partners are looking to us to be the clinical hubs for these conditions. But above all that, I think the issue of communicating with families in a really clear and honest way about what is involved in a clinical trial, I think that is super important, especially now with social media. I don't know if Liz is going to talk about this, but there's a lot of communication that goes on that is important on social media. Some of it's super helpful and some of it's not that helpful, to be quite honest. And so, making sure that we're messaging what we're doing in the right way to families, I think, is super important.
Yeah. So, from the Fragile X standpoint, we started out with 2 or 3 sites that were doing trials, and then we wound up, now we have probably 20 or 30. And I think some of what was done was, once we had a clinic consortium, which Angelman syndrome now has, if there was like a group of families that were near a site that was really not running clinical trials, but was a clinic that was part of the consortium, so in some cases, the local group actually donated money to get that site going. Because what happens in clinical trials is you get the money, you start getting the money during the trial, and then you have it left over after, but you don't have it at the beginning to start yourself up. So when you're a new site running a trial, what you need is some funding to get that coordinator in there so that you can run the first trial. And then often you have money left over from the first trial to run the next trial. And if you run a lot of trials and enroll a lot of patients, then the more sort of money you have. And so now, for instance, at our site, we have 12 coordinators, like 3 for each disease we work on. And so we're not in that same position, but I know what other Fragile X clinics that are starting up and trying to run trials, what they run up against this problem of not having money. And so I think some just need some support to get going.
That's a really fabulous point, and something that ASF has been thinking of a lot about recently. There are sites, like yours at Rush that do have a powerhouse team, but as you mentioned, really specifically to put dollar signs on this, to hire a human to be your regulatory person might cost $30,000 to $50,000, right? To hire a research coordinator might be $30,000 to $50,000, right? If you're hiring a skilled person. So these are things that the foundation is aware of and is looking to support sites across the country who are needing that assistance to be able to get things up and running, knowing that you'll be self-sufficient, you'll be sustainable once you get clinical trials running. But that lead money is or that pilot money is a little bit challenging to come by sometimes, but that is something certainly that the community could help with. And that's what these donor dollars go towards. As Amanda was saying earlier, $50,000, as you can see, could go a long way. So that could go towards supporting staff to get a clinical trial site off the ground.
Yeah, getting a site together to do a clinical trial is not easy. And obviously I have a smaller operation than Liz, but for me to be able to start putting some of these trials is essentially using the personnel that I have for other clinical trials that are not Angelman related, that have been willing to help me. Eventually the money comes back, but it takes months, until you see a penny, because you only will be compensated once the patient is in the in the study. So it's not like you can have an NIH grant that you can have $200,000, $300,000, and then you can start working. In here, you have to have already some structure pre-existing in order for you to start going. And that may be the difficulty that many other sites may encounter to start doing treatment trials. And the problem is going to be a lot of treatment trials, hopefully, and there's going to be a paucity of sites to do that work. So thinking doing some seed money for clinical trial site may be a good idea.
Thanks for that. And I'm clearly seeing a deliverable coming out of this panel that we have here. Clearly, we need to have some sort of expert parents and clinicians, something that is easily disseminatable to the community. But let's not miss this opportunity. Back to you, Shefali. What does it mean to participate in a clinical trial? That was going to be the first question. People started jumping in with good questions.
Yeah, and it really depends on the trial. So, I can use the Tangelo example. So first of all, it's a lot of work for everyone. And it's not just, work. On our end, sure, there's work, but, it's a lot of work on families too, because we're collecting a lot of information from you, not just right after the treatment, right? So, it requires time. It requires a reorganization of your schedule so that you can come, so for Tangelo, for instance, our kiddos were admitted overnight after the intrathecal administration. So that basically required a family to be free for 2 full days, around the times of the administrations, which was 3 times in a row, right? So that takes time that you take away from work and have, care for your other kids and all those things. So I say that not to, I want to encourage people to be in the trials, but I just, we recognize that it's challenging, and that can be a stressor on the child and the family, right? So there's that. And then it requires being able to really participate in all of the other assessments we're doing in between. So, we've moved towards this place of trying to do less in person, because we know how taxing it is on you and your child to have to come in and do developmental assessments. And, just to come to this UCLA, for instance, to do that testing was a lot. And so, even industry realizes that now. So we're doing a lot of remote assessments, but that means having someone in your home to collect data, having an app on the phone so that you can, provide information often on a daily basis for things like sleep or behaviors and other things. So it's an involved process. But, the important piece is that, if we can make sure that our families stay engaged, then it really allows us to learn as much as we can about how these therapeutics are actually impacting our kids. Because, it might be that some of these, what we call secondary outcomes, like sleep and things that we're collecting that are a little bit more, they're less standardized. They're, measures that we're collecting again on apps and at home. Those may be really where we see the biggest signal. But we only can learn that if everyone gives us the information and tries to provide it as consistently as possible. But, full respect for all the families that are in these trials. It is not easy. Liz, you're laughing because I know you've experienced it. So, but.
Yeah, clinical trials, it's a lot of work, both on the clinical trials team and certainly on families, and it's a lot for the community, certainly. So I think that that's an important primer about clinical trials, but we could probably spend all night educating about clinical trials.
Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to discourage folks from being engaged with the trials or enrolling in them. We make it as easy as possible, but it's just that it's work, and there's no way around that. So.
Absolutely.
Hey guys, it's Amanda here. As you know, we're here for you, our community. If you have questions about any topics we can discuss in our podcast, or if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. All you need to do is email me at dearamanda@angelman.org. Thank you so much for listening and your continued support of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation.
All right. We have some other fabulous questions here. Let's get to it. All right. To Jody Hart, I just want to reiterate, we were super excited last night to hear Ionis talking about including adults in their phase 1/2 clinical trial or phase 1 clinical trial that's hopefully upcoming later this year. So we're hoping to understand a little bit more about these treatments in adult patients, and hope that other clinical trials coming down the pipeline may also be including adults as well. So I don't think we will only be talking about pediatric clinical trials. I think Ionis is setting the stage for this, and we will be seeing other clinical trials in adults, hopefully. All right. And getting back at the same question. So, we can go into touch on Win-Han's point here for a second, but are there trials involving mosaicism in Angelman syndrome? I think this is getting back at that same question of, are there currently trials involving UPD or other genotypes? And when Han brought up the point that today in our scientific session, we did hear a little bit more about kind of dose-dependent responses to these ASOs. And so again, I think part of these initial clinical trials is to help us understand exactly how much UB3A expression we can expect to see from these clinical trials. And once we know that, we can better understand what patient populations, i.e. mosaic patients who maybe have a little bit of expression of UB3A, or UPD patients who, when we activate both copies, we're going to see more. So again, this is all part of what we're learning from these initial clinical trials. And hopefully we'll be able to guide what patient populations will be best served by each intervention going forward. But that brings up an interesting question that we hear a lot is, what's kind of the time frame that you might see? When can we expect to hear from these initial clinical trials?
Well, so I think because genetics had their big fiasco, they presented all of their data early because it was very clear they were only going to treat those 5 patients for a little while. And so they went ahead and analyzed all the data. Basically, the other phase 1-2 trials that are coming out through Biogen and Roche are designed as very long-term trials where theoretically the patients do bridging doses and then they do an open label extension, and like no one ever has the medication fully taken away. So of course usually you wait until the trial is over and then it ends, and then you do a database lock, and then usually about a year after the trial ends is when the company releases information to the participants, and probably by then they're if the trial's successful, certainly they're publishing results and presenting at meetings. But if it's a trial like these are designed, where they just basically kind of go on forever, there has to be an empiric cut point that the company decides, okay, now we're going to disseminate results. That usually if something is highly positive, they're more likely to disseminate it than if they don't see anything. But that doesn't mean that they don't see anything. It could also mean that they feel if they put information in the public domain, that will impact their regulatory strategy, and that the FDA will not look, will look negatively upon that. So I think in the situation of the ASO trials, it's going to be highly variable and dependent on the trajectory of each one of these trials. But in general, in a trial where you're doing just a placebo-controlled trial and then it ends, it's usually a year after the trial ends.
To hear about that completed phase of the study, and then before we can expect subsequent phases to start.
Most companies will let you know if you were on placebo or drug. Obviously, that's not relevant to the ASO trials because everybody's getting treated right now. But most companies will let you know if you were on placebo or drug during the placebo-controlled phase, about 1 or 2 years after the study ends.
So let's demystify this while we're here. So why are some studies placebo-controlled and some are not?
Well, most studies are placebo-controlled, but very early studies that are safety studies may not be, because predominantly you're looking for the safety of the agent. I think also some studies that are in a rare disease and may have a very high impact on the disease may produce a result that's so striking that you don't actually need a placebo. And I think that is, or a sham control. And I think that is what might be hoped with Angelman syndrome, but that has been done in several diseases where it turned out that the impact of the drug on the disease was so huge that it was determined it would be unethical to run a placebo-controlled trial. So I think right now we're in early trials, and so we don't have placebos. There's certainly talk about sham-controlled trials for phase 3 for all the ASO studies, and I think exactly how those will be designed will be dependent on what we see in these early studies.
Is there a role for the community to play in clinical trial design?
There is. I mean, in ultra rare diseases where you actually can't randomize very many people to a placebo group, it becomes a statistical nightmare because especially if the disease is variable, you might actually approve or not approve a drug based on who you randomize into the control group because the groups are so small. So there's been a lot of discussion recently at the FDA about that and using different kinds of measures like natural history and pre and post dose trajectories. And of course, Roche had Freesias. And I'm sure this was one of the ideas behind Freesias. It's a very good idea where you follow patients for a year and look and see how much do they change in a year. And then you put them on an ASO and follow them. And if their trajectory really, really changes a lot, then that might support being able to do a development program without placebo-controlled trials. There certainly are conditions, I'm involved with one of them right now, where the families really go to FDA and tell them they don't think it's ethical to do placebo-controlled trials. Those are mostly degenerative conditions where the child will potentially get worse or even lose their life during the time of the trial if they're randomized to a placebo or a sham. So that doesn't apply to Angelman. So I think here we're going to be whether we do placebo or not is going to really depend on the effect size in the early trials. And whether it's a believable result, like the FDA doesn't think, oh, it's just, it's just placebo effect that people are just rating this. It's not real. And that's why some of those objective measures like the EEGs and the Bailey and all of those things, I mean, you may hate doing all those things, but those are the things that could potentially keep you from having to do a placebo-controlled trial in the future. Although only time will tell.
We saw a lot of exciting work today talking about correlating the Bailey and EEGs. And while in the community, these are really cumbersome tasks as for families. Nobody likes doing an EEG. Nobody likes doing a Bailey. They're all very painful, but they're important measures that could potentially help avoid placebos in the future, hopefully. All right, so let's pivot here a little bit and talk about site selection, because we've had a lot of question about how a site is chosen, how a physician, say you have a local clinic and they're fabulous, but you have a great clinician, but they're not running clinical trials currently. Are there ways to run clinical trials in the future? Dr. Bacino, how would you suggest how does that happen? Shed a little light on this.
Yeah, well, I think that there are a lot of really very good clinics and clinicians out there, and that may not necessarily yet be ready for a clinical trial. I don't think there is anything wrong for those families to seek a place in a different site or place. Problem is that it is a big it's a big effort from the family just to be able to travel, to do all of the things that require the inconvenience from their job and what happens to that children and other children in the family. So I really, my heart goes for all of the families that really go into these trials because they commit a lot. So it would be great to have many different sites that will be able to run some of these clinical trials, and I do hope that more will be started, because again, if you see all of the different possibilities coming in the near future, there's going to be a lot to choose from. But I think that it's really more about what the families want to do. Sometimes, again, since these trials start slowly and the recruitment, the eligibility, until all of these things happens, it takes quite a while. So then that is a bottleneck, for families to get into a trial. But as I said, the reality is all of these families are being very brave to make it into this possibility of a treatment, but ultimately it's going to benefit to everyone. Ultimately, if a drug is doing extremely well, that immediately will probably have an impact on all of the community. So I know that the families are very anxious, because they have either their UPD or their imprinting center, and they don't yet know whether they're going to be part of a trial. But I think that this is ultimately going to help everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, on that topic, I'll just add, the 15Q Clinical Research Network that Shefali was referencing in the beginning. We have a network of clinical trial sites currently in the United States, and one of the benefits of this network is it really is a learning network of clinicians. There's a clinical trials committee within that network, and so that if people are interested in running clinical trials, certainly, we encourage, this is not just closed to current existing multidisciplinary clinics. So if there are clinicians out there who are interested and are seeing multiple Angelman patients, or even just one, then, we certainly encourage them to reach out to us, or we're happy to reach out to them and include them in this network. And then if they're demonstrating interest in running clinical trials, that's certainly something that we're more than willing to chat with clinicians about across the country and across the world. Again, I was really encouraged last night to hear so many additional sites outside of the US. We heard that genetics was approved to start in the UK and Canada. Ionis really had a broad global distribution of clinical trial sites that were anticipated. Neuron, is headquartered in Australia and running most of their phase 2 study out of Australia. And so I think, there are clinical trial sites outside of the US, particularly in Canada and the UK and across the world. One site that I will draw everybody's attention to, if you don't already know about it, and we can put it in the chat box, is clinicaltrials.gov. So if you're wondering where clinical trial sites are, you can go and just put in Angelman syndrome into clinicaltrials.gov, and all of the active recruiting clinical trials, or even ones that are approved but not yet enrolling, you can see clinical trial sites there. So you can see whether there are sites in your country if you're outside of the US, or see the domestic sites within the US, and you can see whether they're active in recruiting or not.
Hey, Liz, before you move on, just on that topic, we have a lot of people who have asked if they are family who are interested in getting the trial, should they be contacting an AS clinic in order to do that? If someone could shed light on that, that would be great.
Yeah.
You mean if families want to be in trials?
Yeah.
Yes.
What's your best advice for families who are interested in clinical trials?
They should contact the clinics close to them that are known. I mean, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov and find out who's running the trials, because not all the Angelman clinics are running any given trial, and different ones are running genetics and Roche, and probably will be running Biogen. So so you can go to any site that's near you that you could travel to and contact them and get on their list. We currently have a list of 150 people. But we're kind of dividing them, and we can't, many of the people wouldn't qualify for one thing or another. So we have to go down the list in order based on who qualifies first and who contacted us first. And so that's just our process. We just try to be fair. And when you contact us, you are the next person on the list. We don't play favorites of any sort. It's all based on the time that you get to us. And I don't know what other sites do in terms of prioritization of patients, but I think your best chance of getting involved in the trial is to be in contact with a site that you can see is running all these trials. There's kind of a related question in the chat that's going on about a site that wanted to be a trial site, but was told no by Roche. And I think that when companies look for sites to run trials, especially big companies like Roche, they're looking for past experience. Did you run a trial in different kinds of neurodevelopmental disabilities? Did you run a trial in Angelman syndrome? They send you this big, long feasibility questionnaire that's like 10 or 20 pages that you have to fill out everything at your site. And so it's not like they don't just, you can't just call them and say, I want to be a site. They're going to do this assessment of your site. And you might be a perfectly good site, but it's just that you haven't had experience. And so there can be a little bit of difficulty getting to be a site if you don't have experience. In any case, that may be fair or not. And sometimes companies look at their geographic distribution, where if they already, like, for instance, if they already have a site in Chicago, they're thinking, well, Madison's not that far from Chicago. It's only 2 hours away. We'd rather have a site like in Seattle, where it would be inconvenient to go. So sometimes they're really looking at where all the sites are on the map so that they can try to cover a country as well as possible.
And I would just reiterate that I think if you're interested in having your child be in a trial, just contacting, frankly, any of the clinics. We can guide you in the right direction. But, I think it's really, it's ideal to have less sites that really have expertise in running these trials and then putting resources into helping families get to us rather than having a lot of sites that are seeing just a couple of kids, because it's, again, as I said, it takes the village to design and run these trials. And so I think even for the family's experience sake, it's better to be in a place like at Rush, right, where you're with a team that has been doing this for a very long time.
I will reiterate
we can definitely
that.
help guide you. Yeah.
Yep. You, I think from both the pharmaceutical company standpoint, but also from the family standpoint, you want providers who know Angelman syndrome. You want assessors who, psychologists who've done a Bailey with patients with Angelman syndrome before, right? I mean, the company's going to require that. But as a parent, you also want that. It's a much more pleasant experience when the whole team knows Angelman syndrome, than when that's not the case. There's a question about, does it have to be in a clinic, or could you just convince regular specialists to start running clinical trials? And for less invasive clinical trials, sometimes just like a drug trial or something like that, sometimes, that has become a little bit more decentralized out of these academic hubs. But for really intensive clinical trials, particularly ones that are requiring anesthesia, sedation, overnight stays, you're going to want that to be in a pediatric center who knows your child's rare disease, that's equipped to be able to handle anything that might go wrong. Because again, these are safety clinical trials. They're safety trials. Their job is to determine whether this is safe.
These are really early trials. And I think the genetics experience emphasized that. If that, event had gone on in somebody's local clinic, it would not have been good, because you have to be tooled up to get the patients in, do the right things for them, treat them immediately. And so these early phase trials where it's a first in man trial, anything can happen, and you wouldn't want that to be going on at a local clinic. It has to be at a center where you can get treatment and address medical problems and do that very quickly. So I think as one goes on, and so the initial safety trials may be at only 6 or 8 sites in the country, or even 4 or whatever. But then as you go to a big phase 3 trial, then there's more opportunity to open many sites, basically because now we know what we're doing. So it becomes easier to have a site that doesn't have quite as much experience.
Absolutely. And these phase 1-2 spots feel really scarce and hard to come by. But as trials progress into phase 3, there will be a need to recruit more patients. There will be more slots across the country, and conceivably, likely even more clinical trial sites as well. All right. Anybody want to hazard a timeline for gene therapy trials starting?
Well, there's no shortage of interested groups, I would say. And I don't know if any of them presented at the thing last night. But it seems to me like they're tooling up to be ready in a year or 2. Does that seem, Shefali, have you heard stuff like that, or Carlos?
Yeah, I think so. I think that a year or 2 at the most.
I mean, things have been, I think the pace has been faster than, I mean, at least that I expected, with this landscape in general. So it could be even sooner, but yeah, that's generally the timeline that I've been hearing as well.
Great. All right. We're jumping around a little here, but let's get some of these questions answered. So I think it was you, Liz, that mentioned that starting in a younger age group was a little bit newer for the FDA. And so this question about, starting in older patients and then going to younger children, what's the rationale behind starting in younger children versus starting in older adults?
Well, I mean, the history of the FDA is that they have required early safety trials to be in adults. So this is actually a bit of a difference in what FDA has required. And it's mainly based on, I think, the data from the animal model that showed that you have to treat earlier, you get a better effect, and the understanding in the field that likely we will have a bigger effect in older patients. And if you ran an only adult trial and you actually didn't see an effect, and this is an issue we had in Fragile X, if you ran the adult trial and you saw no effect, would you know that the drug doesn't work? You wouldn't, because you hadn't treated the patient at a key early developmental time. So I think right now what's going on is kind of a compromise between safety concerns and the need to try to move to a younger age level to see a bigger effect size. So they're kind of allowing this intermediate group that's sort of in the 4 to 17-year-old level where, yeah, we're not going to treat little babies, but we're going to let you go down to a young enough age that you might see a better effect than in adults. But I do agree. I mean, if these drugs have any effects in adults, even if all they did was stop non-epileptic myoclonus, they would be great. We would use them, So there could be different a level of effects that we would be getting in adults that would be very meaningful. But of course, when you're starting your first trial, you don't want to have a negative result. So that's been kind of the compromise between safety and hopefully seeing an effect.
Sorry. All right. As we're approaching the hour here, maybe someone can comment what we know, at least publicly, about physical or motor improvement from these initial clinical trials.
Well, we don't know about progression of motor movement, which is something we largely see at an older age because we just haven't been in these trials long enough to really know whether we can change that. That kind of evolves over a very long time frame. So I would say we don't know much about that. We do know some about gait, or at least from the genetics trial. We know that even on like the Actimyo, there was some gait improvement in some of the patients, but it's a very small number, and we really need to show that in larger trials and multiple trials.
Great. What about this question about exploring differences in intervals between intrathecal injections?
It looks like it was shorter and then it was longer, but so shorter would not be something we'd want to do, but no one does intrathecal ASOs more frequently than once a month, and there's some safety issues with respect to that. For longer intervals, I mean, everyone does believe that we are going to wind up with longer intervals than what's going on in the early trials, but what you have to remember is that the ASO lasts in the body probably 4 to 6 months, and at the beginning, you're using very low doses. So essentially what they're doing to offset the fact that the dose may be too low to see an effect is giving the dose more frequently, because then what's happening is the drug is building up every time you give an infusion, and that allows you to look at safety with each infusion, but also to get to a dose by the end of the dosing period that you would expect might have some efficacy. And the FDA actually requires this now. You can't do a trial where you're going to put children under anesthesia and do an intrathecal injection without being at a dose that you can expect some type of efficacy, theoretically, in exchange for the risk. So it's about the risk-benefit ratio. They won't let you do a trial that has no chance for benefit. So this is why these dosing intervals are closer at the beginning. We all know that just like with SMA, once the therapy is established, probably the intervals will be more like every 4 to 6 months.
Awesome. And I don't know if anybody has any intel on future clinical trial sites in India. I have not heard. I would imagine so in the future, but I have not heard anything. All right. Any last lingering questions from the community? You guys have had great questions tonight, and our panelists have been fabulous.
Can I ask one last question for each person to answer? So we have 100+ people on, most people who are families, people in the community who are parents or caregivers of a loved one with Angelman syndrome. Can each one of you maybe share at the very end here what you're most excited about, or something really positive that you can share with the community when it comes to what we have to look forward to when it comes to clinical trials? I know it's a big question, but maybe we can leave it with that. So I'll start. Anyone wants to start, go ahead and answer.
I think that I will start on because, as I said, going from a time where we had basically nothing to where we are now, that the companies are knocking each other just to come up with an ASO or with the gene vector that will be that will be the best for gene therapy. I think that is pretty amazing. So and this has basically happened in the last 2 to 3 years. So I cannot imagine what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. So I think that there is a lot to be excited about. So I really, I'm more and more positive, and I was already before, but I think I'm more positive now than ever, seeing what is going on. So this drug may not work, but there's actually plenty that are in the landscape, and there's a lot of more sophisticated technologies that let us analyze some of these gene rare gene disorders that will probably even result in different type of therapies. So I'm very, very optimistic about it.
I agree with that. Super exciting. It's why I can't retire, because I've been waiting my entire career for this kind of thing to happen in pediatric neurology, and now it is. So that's super exciting. But I think on a more minute note, the idea that we're actually changing the brain and accelerating learning by, fixing a genetic effect in a disease where we didn't even know if the problem was a fixed problem is extremely exciting. The idea that, I have videos that go on over a series of days, and I watch an Angelman kid, not even be able to hold their breath and then swim across a pool. The motor learning is so fast in some of these situations that it's just watching these videos gets me completely excited. The idea that I'm seeing learning taking place, and I know that the substrate of that is that wiring is going on in the brain, and so we're doing something completely new, and that is beyond exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I would just say that I think in the Angelman space, it's the perfect recipe, where we have the perfect recipe for success in a way that is really, and, Angelman has led the way in so many ways, but, we have an incredibly engaged patient advocacy group. I mean, ASF has done such extraordinary work already and will continue to do so around the clinics and, supporting natural history studies, all the things we need to make sure our trials work, your group is doing. So there's that. We actually understand, I'd say, the clinical features of Angelman in a way that we often don't in some of the newer genetic syndromes that we're diagnosing, right? We know about sleep. We understand the epilepsy. And again, I'm not saying that we have perfect fixes for all these things, but we can measure them. We have lots of data, which I know sounds very scientific, but we need all those data to use those in the trials. We have a biomarker. We have this EEG biomarker that's really robust, that's seen in mouse models. We see it in patients. And then we have these extraordinarily transformative therapies, which is what, both of the others talked about. So that together is the recipe for success. And it's really exciting. I agree with Liz. As a neurologist, people always, unfortunately, ask us often, why are you a neurologist? You're great at making diagnoses, but we don't offer any treatments for children. And I don't think that was always the case entirely, but it certainly was more the case, 10 years ago. And now we make diagnoses and we actually can offer families hope with treatments. And so that's just, it's why we do this work, and it wakes us up in the morning and gets us, just so excited and inspired. So yes, nothing but positive and excitement, I would say, moving forward. So
where we treat the brain and cure all these uncurable genetic diseases. And Angelman's kind of one of the front runners here. So this is very exciting.
Exactly.
You've got Amanda in tears. I've been sitting at my desk, not so silently, fist pumping and cheering all day. So,
seriously, it's true though. It's not a hard question to answer, and we're not. We're physicians. We're not. We would not say things that we didn't really believe in, or to give false hope or anything. That's not. Our goal is to help guide patients, but our goal is to optimize well-being and optimize outcomes and for our families, hands down. That's why we do what we do, and now we're in this space where that's happening. Like it's amazing. It's so great. So, and again, I can't emphasize enough how important ASF has been in this, like without all the patient engagement, like this, when the drugs would be there, but we wouldn't know what to measure. We wouldn't even know how to engage our families. Like there's so many things that wouldn't work if we just had the drug. So I can't emphasize that enough. It's really extraordinarily important.
And also I should add, Amanda, that, there are lots of neurodevelopmental disorders, hundreds of them, but it so happens that Angelman is one of the few that has been selected by many companies to start working. So there is a reason. And I think that because of the biology of Angelman, I think that there is great hope for all of you guys.
I'm a mess.
Well, you guys are amazing. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to be here all week bringing the hope.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly hopeful time. This is a really, really, really exciting.
And I have to say, I'm so thankful for each of you guys. I mean, obviously, this has been a really uplifting conversation and very informative. I also would be remiss not to say that, yes, ASF and their donors have done so much to support this effort, but we have a large community of people who have been working incredibly hard, including FAST and Angelman Syndrome Alliance, and people who are working really, really hard together to figure this out. We're all parents that are like, we're determined. You're not going to get in our way. So I'm just thankful for all the three of you for being on tonight and for all that you do for our community, and the hope that you have given us before and the hope you've given us tonight. I know everyone that's on is probably going to go to bed smiling. Hopefully they'll probably be waking up in a couple hours because their child with Angelman syndrome will wake them up. But they'll go to bed hopeful. So Liz, do you want to say anything else before I wrap up?
No, I just want to say that without ASF, we probably wouldn't have an Angelman syndrome clinic, and we'd be dabbling in Fragile X and PMS and all of our other things, and would not have run these trials, which have been so exciting and such a huge experience in my life personally, as well as hopefully in the families that we've worked with. So I think ASF really got us started, and we plan to continue, and we'll be here right until we're successful.
Well, we're not going to let you go. None of you. I mean, I think it's funny that you think you can retire, because that's just not an option at this time.
No way. Liz can't retire. What would we all do? We'd be calling her on her.
But let me just tell everybody, right? I just tell everybody on the call, Liz Berry-Kravis has an obsession with the drink Tab. If any of you remember the drink Tab.
That is true.
So they don't make it anymore, but you can get it on like the black market in places and send it to her if you want to. So anyway, I know you all have other things to do. So once again, thank you all for being on tonight. We love you all so much. And thank you for the hope and the excitement you've given us tonight. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good night.
Thanks for listening to the ASF podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. And please don't forget to subscribe.